and it's a shame. Liquid will enjoy this a lot. So we're gonna be using liquid simulations, and simulations can be very tricky. They can also be very easy to create some flowing water, to create some splashes. You can use it for a lot of things. I've used it for the comic book, the Big Universe comic book, from time to time as well. For example, when they're flushing through the pipe system, it's easier to just do a simulation instead of having to model the entire water, of course. All right, so what you have to know is that there is a very easy way to set up a quick liquid in a blender. So I'm going to show you the longer way because you'll have to know what the simulation actually entails, what it is, and then I will show you the quick way. So the slow way, you always need an object that will emit a fluid. Okay, so it doesn't matter what that object is. It can be a sphere, it can be the default Blender monkey, it can be a cone, it can be any type of mesh as long as it is enclosed. So if it contains like a volume, and that means that you will be able to use that for fluids. So I usually just use the UV sphere for any kind of fluid simulation, just because it's an easy object. It's very easy to see what's gonna happen. So I usually just go with the sphere. All right, so where do the simulations happen in Blender? Is it a completely different tab? Not completely. It is in this bottom row on the right. There is one tab for physics properties. And this is where everything pretty much happens. So you've got a few different options that you can use. This is also where you do, for example, the cloth animations, soft bodies as well. So for example, you make one of those, what are they called? Like the things that you had as a kid that you could press down and after a few seconds it will jump up. So things like that, very, very nice to do. Rigid bodied as well, something you will use a lot for demolishing stuff. But today we need the fluid. Very easy. So we can just select the fluid. And now you will have only one option to select it first. So you have a domain, a flow, and an effector. And we'll be using all three of those. And by default, you will need at least two of those. You will need a domain and a flow. And a domain is pretty much something you add that will contain your fluid, right? So that Blender won't actually try to simulate your entire Blender scene. You will contain your simulation in a smaller space, because you're working with volumes. Because water is a volume, smoke simulations also need a domain because smoke is also a volume. So you need a domain for those things. All right, because the emitter object, in this case the sphere, has to be the flow. Because this is what you want to turn into the water. This is where water has to come out of. So if you set this to flow, you will first have the setting of the flow type, right? So you have smoke, you have fire and smoke. We'll be doing that later, not today, but in different tutorials in the future. And you will have liquid as well there. So make sure to set that to your liquid. And the next option is the flow behavior. And those two are pretty much the most important ones. So set it to liquid and then you'll have the flow behavior. By default is geometry. And what that does is it turns your entire sphere into liquid. Okay, so you will have as much water as fits in that sphere. So that's basically what the flow behavior of geometry means. And you can also set this to outflow, which basically means that the water will come out of your cube. Let's say it's like a tap, a water tap that you open up, water comes out. That's pretty much what it turns into. And then you still have inflow. I never really use the inflow settings, I'm going to be honest. I use outflow or geometry. That's all I pretty much need most of the times. For now, we're going to use the geometry because I don't want a lot of water. But if let's say you want to control the amount of water in an easy way, you can set this to outflow, and then you can control when the water comes out and when it stops by checking and deselecting the use flow box and actually animating that. All right, so if you want to use that, we want to see what happens first, and that means that we need a domain. All right, so what you would usually do And this is a slow way, remember that. It's add, for example, Shift A, add a mesh, and I always use a cube for it because a cube is easy. And I will usually scale this up a little bit, something like this. And then we do need to set the same settings, right? So we have to set it to fluid, and the type will not be the fluid this time, it will be the domain. So this will contain our water. Right away you can see that it turns into a wireframe model because you don't want to see that cube because your water will be inside, so you want to see the water. And it is set on gas by default, so we're going to set that to liquid instead. Right away you can see that it now turns back to an actual solid shape. We don't want that, so we're going to go to the object properties and we're going to set the display as to wire. So we get a wireframe back. Now, our settings should be set nicely. We've got this as a liquid domain and we've got a sphere that is now our liquid outflow. So if I start the simulation, nothing happens. Beautiful. Right, so we're going to start by doing the resolution of this object. And I'm actually going to apply all the scales first. That's always important when you're working with fluids, is if you scale things down. I scaled this cube, I scaled this sphere. We're going to apply all of the settings. So select it and press Ctrl A and apply all transforms. Right mouse click, set origin, origin to geometry. And do the same for your cube. Ctrl A, all transforms, right mouse, origin to 3D cursor. And now you can see a little cube appears, and this is basically the resolution. So I've got it on 34, which means that one of those boxes will pretty much contain one water particle, which means it's going to be very low resolution. So if I set this to 64, that cube disappears, goes to the corner, but you can see the cube is a little bit smaller. Set it to 128, goes even smaller. So the resolution will define how high quality your water is. Alright, so usually at the start, to find things out, I will start at 32 and work my way up. Okay, so that is the long route of how to create pretty much a water system. And let's see where the water actually is right now. We've got a domain, we've got the water. I'm gonna set this to inflow because I think that's what we need. I had them twisted. So inflow is actually water coming out of it like a tap, and outflow is pretty much a mess, as you could see. So inflow or geometry, right? And basically that's it. That's how you add an easy water system. You can see if I play this, we have water splashing up, going about, and you can see that it's filling up the cube. You can only see the surface of the water, but you can see that it's filling up nicely. And that is because we have water that keeps coming in because we have this set on inflow. Alright, so if we want to control how many water we want, we can right mouse click on the use flow and insert a keyframe like that. So now this little checkbox gets yellow and we have a new kind of diamond after it, which means that our keyframes are now enabled. Okay, and if you want to control this, so control when the water is running and when it stops, you can add a new keyframe. Right, so right now it is set on use flow, so flow comes out. So if we scroll up to, let's say, 20 frames and we want it to stop, we simply deselect the use flow, right mouse, and insert a new keyframe. And in your timeline, if you have your sphere selected, you can see two keyframes as well. So this is where the timeline comes into play. So you can see where your keyframes are set, and you can see that if I now run the simulation, and usually when I run a simulation after I change something, I will change the resolution with one click, right? So select your domain and just up your resolution with one click or decrease it with one click, because otherwise there is a big chance that your simulation will not refresh. So the settings that you will change will not show in the preview unless you actually increase or decrease the resolution. Okay, so if I play this now, 20 frames, water stops, right? So we only have water coming out for 20 frames and then it stops. So it stays at a nice low level. Right, beautiful. Now I'm gonna delete all of this. Now that you know what the elements are, what we need, there is a very easy method to do this in the future. Press Shift A, add a mesh, let's add a sphere, and I'm gonna scale this down because this is what we're gonna be using for the can as well. So I'm gonna scale this down a little bit so it's about the same width as my can, maybe a little bit bigger, like so. Remember to apply your scales, Ctrl A, all transforms, right mouse, and set your origin to your geometry. And now we can just select object, quick effects, and we have a quick liquid settings. And what that does is it adds the domain, so you can see that we've got a new cube. So it adds a domain of fluid, and it will set our sphere, so the object that we had selected, as an actual geometry liquid object as well. One thing that it will do is change your entire viewport to wireframe shading. So I usually just set this back right away to the solid mode. So click that button. I'm going to click my domain, go back to the object properties, go to the viewport display and set the display to wire. Beautiful. Right, so if you don't see anything, make sure that you go all the way back in your timeline to the start, like that, because otherwise your water won't have simulated yet, so there won't be any water in your scene. Right, so always make sure to start from frame 1. So you can now actually see the water in your sphere, in your geometry. So if I play this now, only the water from that geometry will be in my scene. Okay, another thing you need to know about the domain. And there's a lot of information, of course, but it's all very important. So the domain will also be the enclosure of your simulation. All right, so you can see that the water will collide with the domain on the bottom and the sides as well. So that is something that you have to keep in mind. So your domain, your water can't go outside of your domain. So make sure that your domain at the start is about the same size at the maximum range of your water. Right, so we need this to be at our can. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna move my water geometry to the right spot. So I'm gonna go to my front view and just move that right there. And for my object, my domain, I'm going to do the same thing. So just move it to the left a little bit, like so, and move it up as well. So you can already try to make this this water, so we already simulated a bit, make it match with the ground, so the plane that we added. And there's always some thickness that happens in your domain, so the water won't entirely get to the edges of your domain. So it's always nice to have it run for a couple of frames to see where your water collides, and then set it to about your simulation setting, so the ground plane. So try to match those, just like that. So if I now replay my simulation, you can see that already nicely collides at the same height as the ground. So we don't even need to set this plane, this bottom plane, as a collision object. So that's one step we're just skipping. Nice efficiency. Right, so if we want to increase this this cube, you would think that the easiest way to do this is to simply scale it up. But if you scale a domain in object mode, it will mess up your simulation. So what I usually do is go to edit mode and make my adjustments there. So I'm now in edit mode and I'm just gonna select my top part. I don't need this quite as high. I'm gonna set this to right above my sphere, and I'm gonna select the loop of the side faces, so just double click. And I'm going to scale this and press Shift Z. So I only scale this in Y and X. So I want this to be a little bit bigger. You can go into your camera view and see exactly how large your camera is. So press S and Shift Z. And I'm just going to scale this right about there. So it's just around the camera. Something like this. And when we play this now, let's see if it actually refreshed or not. It did. The way you can tell this is because we scaled our domain and our water particles are also colliding with the new dimensions of this plane. So that's beautiful. What we're gonna do next is, if you've seen the preview of the Red Bull render that I shared, is that the water splashes up a little bit, right? So it doesn't just simply go to the side, it splashes up right around the can. And to do this, we need an object that actually interacts with the water. So we need a collision object. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna select my can, Shift S, cursor to select it. I want my new object to be at the center of my scene. So I'm gonna press Shift A, and let's see, we're gonna add a circle. Scale this down so it's just the size of my my can as well. And I'm just gonna move this to the bottom. Right about, let's say right about there. It doesn't really matter for now. And we have to think about the way that we want this water to splash up, because the shape that we're now going to create will highly influence the simulation of the water, of course. So if you want to have it splash up a little bit, you need to think about a cone shape. Well, it's not really a cone, it's more of those, let's say those skater kind of half pipes. So it has to go up, so we need a curve. So I'm going to select my entire edge that I just added, so the circle. I'm going to press E and S and just scale this up first, like this. And I'm going to press E and Z and move this up. And I'm going to press S to scale this to the sides a little bit, like that. And I'm going to press 2 to go to edge select, and I'm going to just double click on this edge right there. And I'm going to press Ctrl B to boolean this, or I mean to bevel, and scroll up a few times just so we get that nice smooth ramp. Left click, right mouse, just shade this smooth, because why not? And we still have a hole in the center. I want to close that because otherwise the water is just going to fall right through. So I'm going to press tab, double click on that edge and press F. There we go. And for water to actually interact with your object, it's always useful to add some thickness. Because otherwise you only have a 0 thickness geometry, and that can get very weird in your simulations. So I recommend to add some thickness even though you think you don't need it. So I'm going to go to edit mode, press A, and press E, and just extrude that to the bottom. Doesn't matter how far, and I'm just going to press SZ0 just so that our bottom is flat, and I'm just going to move this up a little bit so it is above my floor. I don't know why, it just looks better. Right, so we've got our object. How do we make it interact? Easy. We go to the same settings. We go to physics properties, and you may now think that we need to add a collision. Well, that's not the case right now. We need to add a fluid first and set the type to effector. A collision will not affect your fluid simulation. A collision is meant for actual physics simulation, so when you want objects to collide in simulations, that's when a collision can help you out, in combination with our rigid body, for example. But if you want working with fluids, you need an effector, and the effector type needs to be a collision, just like that. Right, so there is this thing in Blender where, well, at least from version 2.9 and up, you either need to add surface thickness, or you need to select it as a planar mesh. So that is just something that you have to know. If your object doesn't work as a collision object with your fluid simulation, let's see, perhaps it does work. We are, after all, in version 3.4 now, I guess. So maybe they fixed it. So if I play the simulation, let's see. You can see that it actually does now interact with our object, so I guess they fixed it. That is nice. So we don't need to tweak any of those settings yet. But what you can see is that it is a very weak kind of splash. It's just very, very tiny. So we're gonna increase that. And the best way to do that is to just set our emission object, so select it. And we can just give it some speed, initial velocity. And we are working in the z-axis because the water is falling down. So we want to add some negative velocity, let's say -20. And it is in meters per second, so I'm not sure how to calculate that to the RSPs. I know kilometers per hour is like this amount times 3.6, but I'm not sure how it is in American units. So what I'm just gonna do now is reset my simulation, select my domain. Remember that after you change your settings, it's always good to increase the resolutions a little bit or decrease it so it updates. So you can see that now these little balls are red, and the color of those little balls in the simulation, they show you the velocity of the particles. So the bluish that we just had was, I guess, average speed. Red is high speed. So if you play this now, you can see that it just gets smacked all over the place. Amazing. Right, so that is something that you have to keep in mind. I'm going to set my source speed on 0, I guess, because we don't really need it. And I'm just going to play this. If you do set this on 1, you can see that it gets... let's see, let's update it. We change settings, we need to update it. So sometimes when you do have source and you have your sphere rotated a little bit, then your source velocity will also mess up your direction of the water a little bit. So make sure that you either turn this off or you apply all your skills and your other settings to your emitter first. Okay, so if we play this, you can see that we now get a very nice splash. You can only see the particles yet, but we can fix that very easily by going to our domain settings and scrolling down a little bit. And there will be an option at some point. There is a lot of options. Let's see, liquid. There is an option for mesh. So if we enable that, and we have to reset our simulation, so go back to frame 1. If we now play this, you can see that we actually get a mesh. All right, it shows as a wire for now, but that's because we've got the domain settings set on wire. So as soon as you check your mesh box, you can go to your object settings and you can turn your display back to solid. So now you can see what your water is actually gonna look like. As I said before, this is very low res. Okay, so if we go back to the domain, and your domain will now be the actual water. So if I click on this water, this will now be the domain settings. If I go all the way back to frame 1, that domain will be the sphere, because that's the actual water. All right, so we can increase the resolution a little bit, but make sure that you keep your computer settings in mind as well. If you've got a great computer, you can crank this up to 128, 256 maybe. If your computer can handle a little bit less, then just keep this at a lower amount. 64 works nicely. 128 is probably enough already. So if you have this on 6.4 and play this, you can see that it's getting messed up. So I'm going to go back to frame 1 and just change the resolution once again. Just make sure that you reset the simulation a bunch of times, because somehow it's always getting messed up. Right, so make sure that if something goes wrong and you don't know why that is, just change the resolution a few times and go back to frame 1. And you can see that the water is now getting splashed out with high speeds, but it doesn't interact with our mesh yet. Alright, so you can see that fluid simulations is a bit of a hassle to work around. But knowing the errors that can occur, you can always prevent this or fix this quickly. Alright, so I said this before. Sometimes we need some surface thickness or planar. So we're gonna use planar first, see if that does the trick. Select our fluids, make sure to add some resolution. Go back to the start and play this again. Let's see, there we go, interacts nicely with the mesh. Alright, so some settings you just need to know to tweak when something goes wrong. Alright, so this is our water splash that we have now. So you can see if we go to a camera view, and play this a little bit longer, you can see that water actually splashes nicely. And you can even make an animation out of this, right? Because it is a simulation, so you can let it burn for as long as you need. What you also can do is just set this at a frame where you like it, go to rendered view, and just see how it looks. Because the quick effects and the quick liquid will also give your domain the right water shader from the start. Alright, so if we select our effector, and just hide this with those little icons at the top right, we can see that we have our water simulation in the scene. Isn't that beautiful? Right, so now comes the point where you can tweak your settings to whatever you like, up those resolutions, and we can see that it's now a little bit too far above the can, so we need to move this down a little bit. So I'm going to go to my effector, so the circle, and just move this down a little bit, just on like an estimate. So go back to solid view, press G, Z, move this down a little bit. Right away you can see that your domain square appears again, until you have confirmed your movement. So go back to the start. I'm gonna select my mesh and change my resolutions again for the reset and play this. Okay, let's see what happens. Beautiful. Now hide this. You can see, did it move down a little bit? Not entirely sure. So if that doesn't work, then we simply have to move our domain to the bottom a little bit. So if I go to edit mode with our domain selected, you can see that it becomes the cube again, because it will always be a cube domain because we added a cube object. So I'm going to move this down a little bit, just like that. And I'm also going to just move this down a little bit. So the entire object. So press GZ, move this down a little bit like so. And I'm just going to make sure to reset my simulation, and I'm actually going to crank up that resolution a little bit. I think my computer can handle it fine. If you don't hear me at some point, then it will mean that it crashed. But I think it's going to be okay. So make sure to always reset. That is the message. So I'm going to play this. It is going to be a lot slower now because we cranked up all of those settings. Let's see if we can make it to a point where it actually collides with our object. So we can see it falling very slowly. Very slowly. It's making some weird interactions with the scene right now. It's fine. I don't mind it. I like some randomness. Let's see. So you can see that we have a lot more resolution now. So usually when I do the final render, I will set my resolution even higher at about 256. And then I'll just leave it to calculate the simulation overnight. Or I set it to even higher, 512, depending on how much resolution I need. So if I go to my my camera view, and let's find a nice frame, something like this, and go to render view, we can now see that we've got some kind of high quality water simulations. Of course, for realistic renders, we need way more detail, but it's fine for us. So I'm gonna hide this object. You can see that our water is now actually at the bottom of the can. And what we can even do to make this look better is add some foam, right? Because if water splashes, there will be some foam, some small particles, and that's a great way to kind of fake the simulation a little bit more. All right, so what we can do is scroll down to particles, and you will have 3 checkboxes. And if I move this to the left a little bit, you can see what it says. So we have spray and we have foam. So foam will sit more on top of your mesh, and the spray will actually come from your mesh. So if I enable this, we will have to rerun the simulation. That is sad because it takes a bit of time. So I'm gonna set this down to 6.4, otherwise it's gonna take forever. Go back to the start, play this, and you can already see some particles coming out of our mesh, right? So those are the actual spray particles. So that is something we can use. And I'm not sure why there is water coming out of our mesh. Weird. Beautiful. So this is something that we can use now in the render as well. And I'll show you exactly how. So let's see, we've got particles. Gonna let this run for a few seconds until I'm satisfied. And just like that. So you can see that we still see those little particles, those little balls that show the velocity of the spray particles. All right, so we don't really have to tweak anything in the actual domain settings for those particles, because the particles are added in the particle system. And that is beautiful. We already did the particle systems. We already did the tutorial for that a little bit as well when we added those water particles. So if you go to the particle settings on your domain, So the water, you will now see liquid. So those render actually as a particle system. We've got the spray now, and we've got the foam. And you can see how many particles are in your scene. And the more detailed you make your simulation, the more actual particles you will have as well. So it can get very tough on your computer. Okay, so by default, this will be set on render as halo. And that's why you have all of these colors. That's pretty much the halo with the speed indicator. So if we want to render this at like a spray of water particle, there's a very easy way that we can fix this. So I'm going to go back to solid view, press Shift A, add a mesh, and we want something very low poly, very low geometry. So it is very easy for a computer to handle. So I'm going to add an icosphere and set the subdivisions all the way to 0. And I'm just going to press G to move this out. So this is pretty much the geometry that we need. That's all. It is very low geometry, but you won't see it. Those particles are very small. All right, so select your domain, and we don't want to render this as an halo, but as an object, and we want the object to be our icosphere. There it is. So you can now see that we've got tiny little particles splashing out from our liquid simulation. And you can change the scale of those, for example, set the randomness to 0.2 and set the scale to 0.1. That will increase the size a little bit. And go to your camera view and just check how this looks in the render. All right, so already that looks quite nice. So if you want to change the material of those splash particles, you can select the icosphere and go to materials. And we should be able to just add the liquid domain material to that, because that is the water material. So now it is actually a water material and matches the rest of the simulation as well. Right, so we still have some particles left that are rendered as the halo, and those are the foam particles. All right, so we can just set this to an object as well. And let's see, we can select our icosphere and press Shift D and press Escape to cancel that. So now we have 2 icospheres. You can see that in the object tree. I'm just going to rename that to foam particle and select your domain and just set your instance object to foam particle. And I want this scale to be a little bit bigger, so 0.2 perhaps. And I want the material of our foam particle to be more of a white material. So I'm going to set this back to the usual principled BSDF. Base color is white. That's perfect. And let's see why. Yeah, so you can see that we now have some extra foam particles in between of our spray particles. And I think I actually messed up the material of our icosphere as well, because I changed the liquid domain material and didn't add a new material first. So I changed both those materials to white. So what I'm going to do is just select the icosphere, create a new material, and I'm just going to set this to glass, and that is it. Make sure the index of refraction is set to 1.33. All right, so now we have our foam particles that are a little bit bigger, a little bit too big. So I'm going to set this to 0.15 and set the scale randomness to 0.3. So now we have some foam sitting on top of our simulation. All right, so we have water, we have foam, and we have spray particles. And that is usually everything you need for a detailed simulation. So the resolution isn't that high yet. It's fine, I'm just going to leave it at this. If you're going to render this out yourself, make sure to up it a little bit, the resolution, and just leave it rendering for a little bit more time. How are we doing on time? I think we're heading towards the half an hour. So we'll stop that there. So that is pretty much how you approach simulations, at least liquid simulations. There's a lot to play around with. It's a lot of information as well. There's a lot that can go wrong in your simulations. For example, the water that is randomly spraying on top of our object. That's already something that goes weird for some reason. So that's something that I would fix or spend some time on fixing as well, tweak some of the settings of the simulation. Maybe it's an issue of our domain even. So if I edit this, I may have placed the top of my domain a little bit too low. So I may just have to up this a little bit, and then I will tweak those settings. And in that way, I would just come to the final results, which is, let's see, yeah, that's already looking better. So it's not staying on top anymore. Beautiful. So make sure to tweak some of those settings for yourself. And each time you run your simulation on different resolutions, your spray pattern will be different. So you can rerun it, rerun the simulation, and get different outcomes as well. In the end, it's all personal preference. So that is how you can approach your liquid simulations. I hope it helped you in some way or another. Fun thing is you can always use this for example, honey as well, or other liquids as well. You just need to change the domain settings. All right, so you can go to your domain settings, and you can change a lot of settings, and you have viscosity option as well. And viscosity is something you would use, for example, when you render out honey, and that basically means that your objects will have some kind of binding strength together, so they will try to stick together more. So that's how you can also use this for different kinds of fluids. Okay, that's where I'm gonna end it. I think this render is actually complete now, isn't it? I think we have everything covered that I had in the first initial render. So that is nice. So actually, let me just show you real quick how to render stuff. So what I'm going to do first is select the object that I don't want to appear in my render. And I'm going to hide this with the eye icon and the camera icon. And I'm going to go to my render properties. We already have this set on cycles and GPU. By default, your render settings will be set way too high because it will render for 4,000 samples, way too much. I usually use, well, anywhere between 32 and 512. So I'm just going to set this at 128. That will do the trick. Make sure denoise is enabled. And you can play around with optics or open image denoise. I think I usually set this on optics because I ran some tests and I think it's faster. So optics will do the same trick a little bit faster. And the rest of these settings is not something you have to worry about a lot. Let's see. There's a performance setting that you can tweak. If you have a GPU, for example, you can use auto detect, and it will basically define in how many different steps you will render your scene. So my tile size is set quite high, which means that if I render out a scene that is, for example, 1920 by 1080, which is default HD, it will render it out in one go. If I decrease this to 512, for example, it will render it out in 4 different frames, and then combine your 4 different frames in one render. So that's just to speed up your render a little bit. So auto detect will usually set this on the right CPU threads, and for your memory, your tile size is usually already set automatically, if I'm correct at least. It's a long time ago that I set this, so I'm not sure. But play around with that until your render is working. So then just select render or render image and have a look at how this works out. So you can see that we have some objects on the top that we did hide in the viewport but did not hide for the render. So make sure that you look through your object tree and make sure that everything that is turned off, every eye that is turned off, also has the camera icon next to it turned off. And if you can't see that camera icon, make sure to select this filter option and turn on the disable in renders setting as well. So make sure that's blue, and then just make sure that they are set at the same value so the viewport matches with your actual render. So this should be it. So now I can just go to render image, and it will render it out nicely. All right, so I hope you all have something to render out now. I know Maple has been keeping up, and some of you are already rendering out other stuff, so you probably already know how to render. I think everyone knows how to render at this point. But yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing your cans and your liquid simulations later. I hope you enjoyed that, and thank you for watching.